recording started.
You can start, Edward.
Good afternoon and welcome to this meeting of the Cambridgeshire Police and Crime Panel. I'm Edward Lee, Chair of the Police and Crime Panel. The confirmation hearing is being held today to consider a proposed appointment to the position of Chief Executive of the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner. I welcome the candidate Jim Haylett, the Acting Commissioner and his staff here today, as well as those members of the public and press who are watching the live stream of this meeting. Due to the government guidance on social distancing, this meeting is being held remotely. The minutes of the meeting will be produced in the usual way, and a recording of the meeting will be available to view on the Peterborough City Council's YouTube page. To enable the meeting to run in an orderly manner, I would ask all members of the panel and all members watching to keep their video camera switched on for the duration of the meeting and to keep their microphone muted, except when invited to speak. The Acting Commissioner has opted for security reasons to join us via telephone and therefore will not appear on the live stream. Any members wishing to ask questions or make a comment should indicate this by clicking the raise hand function. When I invite you to speak, please unmute your microphone, ask your question and then mute it again to allow the relevant person to respond. If we should run into any technical problems, I will declare an adjournment while the fault is addressed and the public broadcast will be paused. If it is not possible to address the fault, then the meeting may be abandoned until such time as it can be reconvened. I will start with a roll call of members of the panel. Councillor Ali.
Present.
Councillor Bywater.
Present, Chairman.
Councillor Daunton.
Present, Chairman.
Councillor Massey.
Present.
Councillor Sharp.
Present.
Councillor Shelons.
Here.
Councillor Tierney.
Present.
Councillor Lynn.
Present.
Councillor Warren.
Present.
And Councillor William.
Present.
Thank you. And we also have in attendance Fiona McMillan, who is the monitoring officer to the panel, Jane Webb, who's secretariat to the panel, Sarah Spendelow, HR officer to the panel, the Acting Commissioner Ray Bisbee, Jim Haylett, the candidate for the Chief Executive role, Ali Flowers, Head of Compliance, and Matthew Warren, Chief Finance Officer at the Opcc. Jane, do we have any apologies, please?
Yes, we have Councillor Giles and co-opted independent member Claire George and Councillor Woolwork, who is substituted by Councillor Lynn.
Thank you. Now, do any members have any declarations of interest that they wish to make? I see none. Okay, thank you. As the proposed appointment of the Chief Executive, during this hearing, we will ask you, Jim Haylett, some questions to establish how you meet the criteria for the post and your suitability for the role. Members are reminded this is a confirmation hearing, and as such, panel members are not being asked to rerun the selection panel interview, but to reassure themselves that the applicant's suitability and competency for the role has been proven by the selection panel, and that the Police and Crime Panel can properly endorse the selection panel's recommendation. Please note that terms and conditions attached to the appointment are not within the remit of this confirmation hearing. So following the questioning, in accordance with Part 1 of Section 12A of the Local Government Act 1972, and with the panel's consent, the press and public will be excluded so that the panel may continue its deliberations in private. We will advise the Acting Commissioner of our recommendation tomorrow and copy you, Jim, into this notice. It will be for the Acting Commissioner to decide whether to accept or reject our recommendation. A formal report and summary of the reasons for our recommendation will be published within 5 working days of this meeting. So before we start our questioning, Jim, do you have any questions about this afternoon's proceedings?
No, Chair, thank you. I'm pretty familiar with the running order. Thank you.
Excellent. So, Acting Commissioner, would you like to introduce your candidate?
Thank you, Edward, Mr. Chairman. I would, and I'd like to thank all the panel members for attending today. This is an important role that has to be filled. As you know, the purpose of being here today is for the Police and Crime Panel to undertake its role in questioning my proposed candidate, Jim Haylett, for the role of Chief Executive in my office, focusing on his professional competence and capability, his personal independence, and an understanding of the Police and Crime Plan, which, as you know, will change once we have a new Police and Crime Commissioner. By way of introduction, I would first like to refer to the panel to the advert of the role. Whilst there are key requirements, both in terms of skills and experience for the role of the OPCC Chief Executive and Monitoring Officer, what is equally key and fundamentally important is the personal qualities that a person has as a senior leader. I asked in the advert for an exceptional leader, one who would be at the forefront of inspiring influence and enabling others to deliver their work, whether referring to those within the OPCC or our partners, either locally, regionally, or nationally. I hope the panel agree through their questioning that Jim brings that to the role, and in doing so, support unanimously the decision of the interview panel and I to appoint Jim to the role of CEO. I don't need to tell the panel what a challenging 12 months it has been for the Cambridgeshire Constabulary and the OPCC. As you will have seen through the reports you have received and the responses you have heard to the questions you have asked of the Chief Constable, Jim as Acting Chief Executive, and myself. Jim as Acting Chief Executive, and before that as Deputy Chief Executive, has been instrumental in ensuring through his extensive senior leadership experience and his personal qualities that the OPCC team has continued to function effectively under his clear direction during this time. I know Jim will say that it is a one-team approach, but his resilience and management style has empowered and enabled the team to be flexible in their support to help the COVID-19 effort, play an active role in both their direct delivery and supporting partners, achieving some of the key outcomes such as in terms of extra funding, whilst at the same time ensuring that the key statutory functions are continued to be delivered. As such, I know the OPCC team have been fully supportive of Jim during his time as Acting Chief Executive, and I have no doubt that they will continue to do so in the future. And from a personal perspective, Jim has been a huge supportive influence on me, for which I am really grateful. I also know that he has built a solid, trusted and respected relationship with the Chief Constable and his senior leader team. This is one thing that is key for any commissioner, either now or in the future. I don't wish to steal Jim's thunder anymore, but suffice to say that his knowledge, skill and experience from his time in policing whilst in the government office, his time on secondment with the Constabulary and his work with the OPCC is why I and my interview panel unanimously felt that Jim has proved himself to be well qualified and experienced for the role of CEO and to lead the OPCC going forward. In relation to all the applicants, Jim was the top candidate that stood out far beyond the rest. I cannot emphasize that. He really stood out among all of them. Finally, it would be remiss of me not to take this opportunity to publicly thank Dorothy Gregson who some of you may know. Dorothy contributed to managing the OPCC over the years, coupled with her passion, energy and dedication, and played a huge part in keeping our policing service as effective and efficient as it is. I will now hand over to the panel, and in doing so, I hope that I receive your support in my appointment of Jim to the role of CEO in the OPCC. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Acting Commissioner. So we will now move on to questions from the panel. And I'll start with Councillor Lynn, I believe, is asking the first question.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Hi, Jim, again. I would just like to know, what do you feel that you, as leader, can bring to this role?
Thank you for the question, Councillor Lynn. I think it's probably, I mean, I hope I'm going to bring a lot with the build-up that I've just been given by the Acting Commissioner. So, but I think it's useful in considering the role to consider them as being two roles. So the Chief Executive or Chief of Staff, Head of Paid Service, as being one role, and then the Monitoring Officer role as being a separate role, but both carried out by me. And as the panel will be aware, I think the Chief Exec Monitoring Officer role in the OPCC is the only one in the country that combines those two roles. So in terms of the Chief Executive role, that for me is, it's been described as the interface between management and politics. So effectively, the way that I see that Chief Executive role is that I take the lead from the Commissioner in terms of their police priorities, and of course help to draft the police and crime plan, which is effectively a strategy for the county. And I am the delivery agent for that police and crime plan. So managing a relatively small office to deliver those police and crime plan priorities, but also to ensure that the full range of statutory duties that the Commissioner has are fulfilled within the broader governance framework. And within the OPCC, broadly speaking, that effectively chunks up into four main areas of work. So one is maintaining effective partnerships across community safety in the criminal justice system. One is the commissioning of services, particularly victim services. There's a broad group of enabling functions in terms of finance and comms and engagement related. And of course, the big area of holding the Chief Constable to account for policing. So, and as the Chief Executive, that's my job to make sure that the whole system works to deliver all of that. Then if we take the Monitoring Officer role separately to that, the Chief Exec is about delivery. The Monitoring Officer effectively is about how it's delivered. Because, and this is where the relationship between the Chief Exec and the PCC is very important, because the Monitoring Officer is there to make sure everything is done properly in accordance with the Nolan principles, in accordance with legislation. And it's up to the Monitoring Officer, part of my role, to make sure that all of that is done in an appropriate way. And we have decision-making policies and various other things to make sure that happens. And I am there to advise the Commissioner at an early stage whether the proposed courses of actions are acceptable within that whole ethical framework. I'm not sure if I answered all of. Do you want me to cover as to why I think I'm suitable for that, or have we got two or three?
I think there's more questions coming. So perhaps it's best if we don't take it all up in the first one. But thank you for your answer. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So if we move on to a question from Councillor Massey.
Yes, hi, thank you, Jim.
Hi.
What do you see as the key elements involved in delivering what do you see as the key elements involved in delivering major service transformation programs successfully? And can you give a particular example of when you have dealt with these?
Okay, the nature of service transformation for us is very much a partnership approach. It can be quite complex working across multiple partners, whether they are in the Cambridgeshire specific landscape, or as the panel will know, I've done some fairly extensive work on police collaboration as well. So transformation tends to involve a number of partners. Even if it is a transformation within a single organisation, there are multiple challenges with that. And I think using a framework helps, because there is a natural resistance to change. I think it has been described as a natural resistance to loss as well, in terms of what are people losing in a change environment. But one way or the other, change causes concern. And so I think in that context, there are some vital elements. So a very clear strategy and vision in terms of what we're trying to achieve is critical. A very clear articulation of why change is going to be needed, sometimes described as the burning platform. What's the real need for that change? And of course, very much engagement with those affected throughout. But there is something very distinct about that consistency and transparency. And I've already mentioned the Nolan principles once, and there's a reason that transparency is in there. It's so that people can see what is happening and why. And it's much easier to have difficult conversations with people if there is no hidden agenda and there is an element of trust in that relationship. I can give examples of when I have done that, but as I say, my approach with any kind of systemic change and collaboration and transformation is absolute openness at the outset, and get any issues on the table rather than fudging them for sorting out later down the line, because inevitably that causes problems and dissatisfaction, and you end up in a worse position than if you hadn't started.
Sorry, could you give us a particular example of when you've dealt with these? Because you said you can.
Okay, so an example, and I will use a collaboration example on the basis that 30% of the Cambridgeshire budget is spent on collaboration, so it's a hugely important area for us. And it's I won't do the Seven Force programme because that's a very complicated answer, but a relatively simple one. In Yorkshire and the Humber, we had 3 underwater search units in the 4 police forces. Nationally, there were only 12 across the entire 43 forces. So automatically, there's an indication that we are over-resourced in that particular function. So I undertook the business case to go through to assess the viability of rationalisation and collaborating into a single unit. During that process, suffice to say, dedicated police specialists in their dedicated functions are very proud of what they do and what they achieve for the public. And the nature of underwater searches, it's a very niche function and can't be done across the whole organisation. So we were looking at having one unit across 3 forces. And that involved people being redeployed. And so as I was the project lead for that, I was more than happy to actually go and talk to all of the staff affected and face the music, if you like, because everybody knew it had been my proposal. And the reality was the people that were undertaking that function were no longer going to be able to do that, a significant number of them. But because I'd been really clear throughout and the business case stacked up, I was effectively able to say, look, I completely understand where you're coming from, but the reality is the chief constables will either have to make police staff redundant in order to maintain your unit, or alternatively make savings by having a single function and redeploying you as police officers into your existing role, into a more generic police role. And the reality is no chief constable is going to want to do that, make people redundant in order for other people to retain a function like that. I got a lot of resistance from that. I wouldn't say it was hostility, but certainly resistance. But at the end of the day, the transparency throughout and the business case, and to be fair, afterwards people did come up to me to thank me for actually going and facing the music. They described as, other occasions people haven't. They've done it by email and report rather than face to face.
Thank you, Jim. So I think we have a question now from Councillor Bywater.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman. Good afternoon, Jim. I'll let you take your drink. Firstly, just on a personal level, thank you very much for all the work you've done during your period of acting in this position. It's been a very challenging time. So on a personal level, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just in relation to the police and crime plan that you've alluded to, my question is, what skills and qualities do you feel you would bring to the role of Chief Executive, which would enable you to successfully support the delivery of the police and crime plan?
Okay, so in terms of the police and crime plan, I mean, the first step with that is clearly the development of the police and crime plan, because when the new commissioner arrives, then that's the sort of the one of the first things to be thinking about. I mean, to be fair, thinking about in advance. It is in many ways a police and crime strategy. I know it's called a police and crime plan, but to a large extent, it's a police and crime strategy. And I do have experience of being head of strategic planning in a former police force I was in, and have done further work since in that strategic planning environment and liaising with the current Chief Constable and his team about the strategic planning processes within the constabulary. So I do have quite significant experience in that. And I think the easiest way to effectively think of that process, it's understanding the landscape, because no commissioner is going to come in with a blank sheet of paper. We already have existing structures, strategies, challenges, risks. And so it's understanding that landscape. And for me personally, to be understanding the Police and Crime Commissioner's objectives and priorities, and the extent to which we need to do further analysis around that in terms of gauging what the public expectations are. So there's an understand phase, if you like. Then there's a planning phase in terms of how we want to present that police and crime plan, because my experience in the Opcc suggests that clarity on that makes all of our lives easier in the long term, because the Commissioner can be very clear with communications with the public as to what the Commissioner is trying to deliver. You in your role as the panel will be very clear and can track back to what the Commissioner said they were going to do with what they have done. So there is that planning phase and the presentation of it. And then obviously there's the implementation phase. Now, the better the engagement with partners and the other people that will be sharing the delivery of this plan, and the buy-in that we have from them, the easier that implementation will be. There is a technical process for developing the police and crime plan, and the Commissioner has to consult with the Chief Constable, has to then submit a draft to the police and crime panel and consider recommendations. Now, realistically, that can be a technical process and the Commissioner could plough on regardless. But my strong advice is plans and strategies across organisations work when you've actually got the buy-in of the people that are implementing them. And so consequently, when it comes to that implementation phase, if we have the buy-in across those agencies, we can then have sensible discussions about whether our partnership structures and the way things are resourced and delivered are fit for purpose in terms of that. And if there is that buy-in to the plan, it's easier to change those structures and resourcing in order for it to be delivered. And again, my previous work in collaboration and then working in the government office, is effectively negotiation and brokering without the authority of command and control or a statutory power, if you like. The collaborative environment, and as I say, government office was very much about establishing a network of people that I need to speak to, building that trust and having those honest and frank conversations about what is needed doing. And I've substantial experience of that. My time since taking the acting role, whilst I have done some of that because of the demands of COVID and the rapid response to deal with that, I haven't done as much of that now as I would aim to do in the future, particularly as we will be having a new police and crime plan to develop. So that for me is a major part of my to-do list.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Jim. So moving on to a question from Councillor Daunton.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Haylett. So I'm asking you about the monitoring officer role. How, as monitoring officer, will you seek to encourage the maintenance of high standards in the way that the acting Police and Crime Commissioner and the OPCC operates?
Okay, and I think, thank you for the question, Councillor Daunton, and I think that relates back to my earlier statement about the overall role is actually, you know, two roles. Now, some people someone might challenge me on this, but I don't consider the monitoring officer role to be a role to be used in extremis. So my monitoring officer hat sitting in a cupboard to be, you know, taken out of the cupboard and put on once there's a major issue to deal with in terms of a suggestion of, you know, inappropriate illegal activity. For me, the monitoring officer role starts on day one with the chief exec, chief of staff role on day one. And I think, as with many areas, this is a very complex role that the Police and Crime Commissioner is taking on. And it's fraught with pitfalls. And so the monitoring officer role is there to protect everybody, to make sure that whatever actions and decisions are taken in the appropriate way, because a commissioner can fall foul of the legislation and statutory duties unconsciously. And so for me, that monitoring officer role goes hand in glove with the chief exec as being the absolute support and advisor for the commissioner to deliver on their behalf the full range of statutory duties. And hopefully that relationship is forged very early on in a trusted way, whereby if I do have to, as monitoring officer, suggest that something needs to be done differently, whether that's behaviour or a course of intended action, I think if we have that right relationship from the outset, with an open and transparent communication, trusted relationship, then it's much easier to have a conversation about potentially a small issue than it is waiting until that has escalated to the point of it being a big problem. Because, you know, if we wait that long for it to escalate, the courses of action become much more limited. And I think that can start on day one with things like a discussion around the operational independence of the Chief Constable and what that means, and how interference with that already starts straying into the monitoring officer territory. So in a non-confrontational, non-explosive way, we can start having that discussion so that both myself and the Commissioner are completely aware that whilst I'm there to support, there's times where I might have to put a red flag up and say, hold on a minute, whilst, you know, let's talk about the outcomes you're after rather than that particular route that you've decided. So as I say, for me, it's a day by day activity in terms of you know, rather than waiting for it to be a major issue before I put the monitoring officer hat on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So moving into a question from Councillor Sharp.
Thank you, Chairman. Jim, my question is, during your time as interim chief executive over the last 10 months, obviously, have you identified any areas in which you would need to develop new skills or enhance existing ones in order to fully meet the requirements of the role? And how would you go about addressing those needs, if there are any?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, really, in terms of particularly on a suitability interview with so many people to identify why potentially I'm not suitable for the role. But there is, yeah, no one is the finished article, I think, fair to say. I think my experience historically has been in policing, policing and the OPCC. Policing is by definition non-political. Then, as I've been in the OPCC for the last 7 years, I'm in a politically restricted role, albeit working for a politician. And I suppose for me, the political landscape in Cambridgeshire is complicated, in as much as I think we have every kind of local authority model that there is available, with a mayor and a combined authority, districts, county and a unitary. So that is a complex political landscape that I haven't particularly been involved in. And so for me, my gap, I suppose, and what I would need to develop is a better understanding of how the politics works within the county. Not because I'm involved in politics, but I think in my role as chief executive, if I'm delivering for the commissioner as a politician in a political landscape, I need to understand that landscape to be able to then advise in terms of how we might achieve the outcomes that the commissioner has asked me to deliver. I mean, I have also on the same theme, I think there is, as the head of the organisation in terms of the chief of staff of the OPCC, it's incumbent on me to not just think about my own development as well. It's about the broader development of the office as well. And I've just recently started a series of development days in order to address some of those issues. And I'm hoping that as part of that process, my team will identify issues that I need to work on as well. So it's not just the things that I think I need to work on.
Just coming back briefly, so those development days are for all of the OPCC staff, yes? Yes.
So at the moment, you know, as the acting commissioner said at the outset, this has been a particularly busy and turbulent year, and so I wouldn't want to over-egg what I've achieved in terms of development, but I have an all-staff development session planned as regards project management, because we talk about project management quite a lot. We don't deliver ourselves many projects, but it's useful if all the staff in the office have an understanding of the concepts of project management, so that's open to everybody. The day that I held earlier in the week was just at the time for the senior management team in terms of addressing the overall management style within the office, because as a small office, I think it's absolutely important that everyone is you know, we delegate and empower to everybody so that they can do the maximum within their role. It's more, people are more innovative in that circumstance, more committed, and the job is more satisfying. And so what I want to do is make sure that across the office, the management style that permeates is one of empowerment and delegation.
Okay, thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Jim. So moving to a question from Councillor Wiggin.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Jim. My question is, could you please provide an example of where you have challenged the course of action set out by a superior?
Okay, so I mean, my back, it's somewhat difficult for me to give an example, because having been in the OPCC for 7 years, any example that I give in that context potentially will lead people to jumping to conclusions. But in terms of my approach, so 27 years in the police, effectively, that is what the job is about, challenging behaviour that is unacceptable. Within that context, having managed large numbers of staff, I've dealt with a multitude of difficult conversations with staff, including with probationers who had their career ambition was to be a police officer, and I've had to sit down with people and explain to them how they're just not going to be suitable for policing despite how hard they try. And I've also been within professional standards investigating police officers and liaising with the IOPC or IPCC as it was then. So I don't enjoy that challenge process, but I have done a substantial amount of it in my time. And my approach to it, as you will probably not be surprised to hear, is I'd rather have the conversation early before things escalate, because my options in terms of how things can be resolved are much broader. And so consequently, we have that conversation. But ultimately, if completely out of the blue, I find inappropriate conduct that I can't unpick, unwind, stop from happening, then I have to have that difficult conversation. And as I say, my background is such that I've had many, and as I say, whilst not pleasant, they have to be done. I think it's always my experience is, and this is where I suppose my police experience I draw from in terms of that decision-making approach. So it's with an investigative background, it's very easy to jump to conclusions when you receive information about alleged inappropriate conduct of some kind. So there is always something for me about ascertaining those facts. There is something for me around ascertaining what the precise position we're in as regards legislation or codes of conduct or guidance or policy. So it's because that then will give an indication of what options I have, what outcomes, whether I have to route something through the IOPC. So as part of my role, if there is a complaint of serious misconduct or criminality with the Police and Crime Commissioner, then my route in dealing with that is the IOPC. So as I say, it's a logical process to try and make sure that we're not jumping to conclusions, but equally, quite often things dealt with swiftly are dealt with better.
Thank you, Jim. So now moving to a question from Councillor Lynn.
Thanks, Chair. How you getting on, Jim?
I'm doing all right. You get another bite at the cherry.
Yeah, just last one from me. How would you ensure an open environment where members of staff at the OPCC can express their professional opinion and be heard, even when it may conflict with the views or strategy of the PCC?
Thanks for that. It's I think that does link back a little bit to my previous answer around empowerment and delegation. We do have a small staff within the office. The legislation is clear that the chief exec is the chief of staff, head of paid service. So in effect, the staff in the office are my staff. And so it's me that is delivering on behalf of the commissioner through my staff. And so it very much is about personal style. And part of my approach in terms of that leadership style across the office is a very empowering one, and I know almost a no deference to me sort of approach, because it's very easy for someone with my experience and seniority, with a small staff in the office, some with little experience of the workplace. It would be very easy for me to sort of railroad through issues and be very directive in my approach, particularly if my approach is aligned with the PCC on a policy area. Whereas I think it serves nobody any value for that to actually happen. There should not be in our environment any issues that aren't open for discussion. In my policing world, that would have been a bit different. There's a time and a place. You know, when the muck and bullets are flying on a Friday night, that's not the time for a big open discussion about our tactics and policies and things like that. But in my office, that doesn't happen. Well, not often. That doesn't happen. So consequently, it's you know, if someone's got an idea, I want to hear it. With any new members of staff, I do say to them, you're going to spend your first month not knowing whether you're coming or going because of all of the information overload. But in a month's time, I want you to then come back to me and have a discussion about things that you think are odd about the office, because it's those fresh eyes coming in that will have the view that I want. After a couple of years, people end up being a round peg in a round hole, whereas I want to speak to the square peg in the round hole when they come into the office, because they're the ones with the sort of the landscape status quo challenging ideas. So I think it is an overall leadership style. I could say relatively superficially, you know, we'd have a suggestion scheme and that sort of thing. But the reality is it's a culture issue more than it is a process issue when it comes to things like that. And as I say, if nobody comes to me with ideas to how we can change things, nobody challenges any of our policies and strategies, I should be worried, I think.
Thank you, Jim.
Great, thank you.
So we have a question from me now, which is about the relationship between the OPCC and the panel, and how you envisage that relationship and how you will develop it.
I think the principle is the same as other relationships. So for me, there are key relationships between the Commissioner and the Chief Constable, the Commissioner and the Chief Executive, the Chief Constable and the Chief Executive, and then the Joint Audit Committee and the Commissioner and my team together with the panel. I know of no area that I've ever worked in where a negative relationship has enhanced the business. And when I say the business, I mean the outcomes to the public. Quite simply, it doesn't matter how good your systems, processes, strategies and structures are, it's all about the people. And so for me, there is a it's not really cards on the table, it's a frank discussion, I suppose, in terms of the lived experience of the panel with commissioners and chief executives up to now, and the lived experience of me and my staff of the panel, to then have an open discussion about, are we both getting out of it what we should be getting out of it as per our roles and responsibilities. I think the panel has a very clearly defined role. The role of my office is less clearly defined for the panel. It says that I provide reports as and when requested, but whether I provide you with a report that's 2 paragraphs or 20 pages kind of is within my gift. And that's why the relationship becomes important, because, you know, it's an expensive function having, you know, people on the police and crime panel for the meetings that we have. And so there needs to be some public gain from that. And for me, there are aspects that we can improve upon. I have already had a discussion with yourself, Edward, and I'm more than happy to have further discussions in terms of that, because, as I say, a non-constructive relationship doesn't help anybody.
Thank you, Jim. Yep, agree with that. So moving on to a question from Councillor Massey.
Me again. Hi. In the past, it has been noted that the chief executives have often spoken on behalf of the PCC in panel meetings. How would you both make sure that you support the Commissioner in these meetings, but also allow the Commissioner their own voice?
Yeah, it's a tricky, I have to, speaking for myself, the panel meetings are quite challenging in as much as the breadth of work that comes into our office is absolutely enormous. So because it's anything to do with policing, past, present and future, anywhere within Cambridgeshire, and then anything to do with the whole criminal justice system, community safety. So it becomes a huge task in terms of preparing for those meetings. And I think, again, that's one of the issues, I think, referring back to the previous question about the relationship with the panel. It's if we get to the point where we can plan the agendas, and so we know the areas of business that you're wanting to have a look at, and some sort of rationale as to why, what are you trying to get at, it helps us to prepare better. I know it's been very unfortunate with COVID, the way that we've had to operate, but at times we have had 25, 30 questions come through from a range of BCB papers without knowing the questions on the day as well. So it becomes almost an impossible task for the Commissioner to be all over the detail of all of that. And I think that's why at times I have stepped in. But the reality is the Commissioner does direct me as the Chief Executive on what the Commissioner wants achieving, and I direct my team. And so there is inevitably going to be times, particularly on some of the really complex areas, that no Commissioner would ever be all over the detail of. But as I say, for me, it comes back to that issue about what is the relationship with the panel in terms of the dual support and challenge function, how we plan that business through, and the nature of the reports and the nature of the sessions that we're going to have. And I think if we get to that position where everybody is on the same page with that, the outcomes that the panel are after in terms of being able to scrutinise the PCC will be met.
Chair, you're on mute.
Thank you, Jim. So just moving on to a question now from Councillor Daunton.
Yes, thank you. So, Mr. Haylett, how do you think your background as a former police officer will inform your new role?
Thank you. It's an interesting one, the former police officer. It provides good context because this is, as I mentioned, a complicated landscape in the first place: community safety, criminal justice and policing. But there is a danger that, and it's something that happens within policing, those senior officers that have got 30 years in need to check themselves that what they think is happening to the 2-year officer driving a car around and the beat is the same as it happened 28 years previously when they were in. So I am acutely aware that my policing background is well out of date. But what it does do, it provides some context for me that enables me to engage effectively with the force. The thing I suppose that I take almost on a daily basis from my policing time is the approach to decision making, logical approach that, I mean, we didn't call it the national decision-making model in those days, but that kind of style of approach to decision-making. The forensic nature of that in terms of the evidential base for decisions and the applying of legislation, particularly in the monitoring officer role, but not just monitoring officer, all of the complaints functions that we do. So there is an importance of being able to assess a situation against the legislation. And I suppose the other thing is, as with most officers that have served a long time, you know, I have been involved in some very serious incidents, very scary incidents of real significance to individual members or collective members of the public. And I think that is useful for me in terms of contextualizing what I'm dealing with. So I'm not saying I am, you know, cool as a cucumber throughout, but when things are happening that are causing people angst, I think having dealt with far worse, more sort of harmful issues, it does contextualize and bring it into context. So as I say, it's a range of things, but the police operational experience per se, for me, is too out of date for that to actually inform much of what I do today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Moving to a question from Councillor Ali.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, Jim. Good afternoon, and thank you for stepping up to the plate during these unprecedented times. My question is around engaging with our diverse community that we have in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, and how you would support the PCC in engaging with residents from all different backgrounds. We've got different demographics. The landscape is quite different. We've got the rural areas, we've got the urban areas, and you know, the role and the strategy in engaging with all our communities and maintaining that independence in your role as well.
Thank you. Yes, the engagement piece is absolutely critical, and I think throughout COVID there's been some benefit because we are able to engage more like this than we would, you know, in physical times. But equally, there is a fatigue element of that as well. So in terms of the style of engagement, the acting commissioner is my third commissioner that I've worked under, and I did reflect on the engagement piece, and I think it is very much about the style of the individual commissioner, the degree to which they want to engage collectively, personally, through surgeries, through the parish council. I mean, we have 260 parish councils, so I don't think any commissioner is going to want to go and see them individually, but it's how do you access that, and also how do you access the communities and the people, because it isn't just about communities, it's about the people as well, that really haven't shown an interest in engaging. There are so many reasons why we need that engagement, why we need that support. So for me as the chief exec, it's not for me to define what that strategy looks like, but it is absolutely for me to ensure I've got the resource and the capability within my office, so that when the commissioner lands and gives me an indication of how they want to do their engagement, we're in a position to support them. In the last few days, I have been talking to my staff because at some point there needs to be a thought really around. So I only have, I think it's probably about 15 staff now, but by the time you take away our administration staff, those that deal with the sort of technical governance bits, the finance bit, you know, I don't have many people to play with really in terms of the discretionary activity. But so there is something around looking at the partnerships that we are involved in now. Some of them are statutory responsibilities. So any new commissioner is still going to need us to be involved in that. But some of our other work is non-statutory work, and we're doing it because it's in our police and crime plan. Now, when we've got a new commissioner, I can't really see a justification for me carrying on with my staff dealing with non-statutory functions that the commissioner hasn't put their support behind. So there is that early conversation with the commissioner to say, right, this is the resource envelope, this is the sort of mandatory to-do list, and this is the discretionary list, and it's a zero-sum game. You want us to do more of this, I need to do a bit less of that, but absolutely steered by the commissioner in terms of how they want to do that.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, that was an interesting insight. Now I have a further question for you, which is, it is of course critical that the OPCC develops trusting and mutually respectful relationships with staff in the OPCC and constabulary, partner agencies, the police and crime panel, the media, the general public, and so on. Could you describe, I mean, you've touched on this already in a number of answers to your questions, but could you describe, perhaps in more general terms, your approach to building and nurturing those relationships?
I think anything to do with culture and trust starts with me first. It's all very well looking elsewhere, but as I say, anything integrity, culture, trust, it starts with me in terms of, do I engender that trust and confidence in my staff and the people that I deal with? I sincerely hope I do, and if I didn't think I did, I wouldn't have applied for this post, certainly. I am pretty straight talking. I prefer matters on top of the carpet rather than under the carpet, or on the table rather than under. And so the culture of an organisation is strongly impacted by its leader. So consequently, I would expect my staff to take my lead in terms of that approach. I think signalling issues before they come about is a good thing. Nobody likes to be ambushed at a meeting, that funding is going to be withdrawn or something else is going to happen. So there is something about that open communication and signalling. We are in difficult times. In that partnership environment coming up, there are a lot of constraints and there is a lot of vulnerability emerging post-COVID. And so there are some really difficult decisions to be made. And I think there is a real need for the relationships between officers to be as strong as it can be, because people are proud of the organisations that they work in, and something that's going to be harmful to your organisation because of a decision by another organisation can cause tension. And so a style of communicating whereby we are open and share issues. So before you make your decision that will negatively impact on me, share your thinking, because we might be able to come up with an alternative solution. So that kind of approach, really.
Thank you very much. Okay, so moving to a question from Councillor Shelland now.
Sorry, Councillor, you're on mute. Councillor, you're still on mute.
Edward, you're on mute.
No, got there. And I do apologise for that. I've been caught like that many times, and I seem incapable of learning. Jim, you will be pleased to know that you're over halfway. So, and you're still standing. I've got a question here, but I've thought of another question as well. So if we've got time at the end, I might hit you with that, and that's be a surprise for everybody. Looking at the paramount need to maintain effective engagement with residents of our community, if confirmed, and some of this overlaps with Councillor Ali's question, what would you see as areas that are working well currently? What would be your most challenging challenges, if you'll excuse the phrase, including hard to reach groups? How would you intend to approach the former groups? And what would be your plan for the latter? Answers on a postcard.
Yes, I was going to say, and shared widely, because I think most organisations are having the challenges of engagement, particularly with, as you say, hard to reach groups, but equally, they're not hard to reach groups, but you know, so the young, I think it was referenced that when we were talking about the precept survey at the last panel meeting, you know, young people engaging with us. So I don't want to duck the question, but I do think this is a question for the Commissioner at the time. The reflecting on the engagement style of the commissioners that I've worked for, there are different styles. I mean, there is something around creating the capacity. There is something around creating the systems. Part of that is if people are being reached out to, but don't like what they're hearing, they won't engage. So there is something around that strategy in terms of what messages are we putting out? Are we actually listening? And I think this does link back to the conversations that we had around the neighbourhood policing changes. I know it's a bit of a sudden leap from the question on engagement to that, but this is around the Commissioner and the Chief Constable being in the right right place as regards their duties. So for me, where there is a significant issue, challenge, change, concern around policing, that is absolutely the forefront of where the Commissioner should be in terms of engaging with the public with that. But it shouldn't just be on those occasions. For me, I would seek to have, we are heavily reliant on ECOPs. I know that we are heavily reliant on ECOPs, and it's quite easy to remain so because there are 20,000 subscribers. If we put something out to ECOPs, we will get a response. But equally, we know that that is not really tackling the issue that you're getting at in terms of the hard to reach groups. That's one of the reasons why, you know, one of many reasons why we've recently created the independent scrutiny group for stop and search and use of force, because we know that the raw data shows disproportionality in that respect. We are doing more work as regards disproportionality in the criminal justice sphere. And then recently, we have been awarded the COPAC Transparency Award, which we hadn't got last year. With it, you know, and part of the reason for that is the accessibility functionality we've now got on our website. So that it's a piece of software that we bought, which means that our content is much more accessible to people in terms of language, as well as things like you know, people that have difficulty with sight. So I think there is a whole range of things there, Councillor. There is better engagement, a better understanding of our communities, so that there is a plan to engage, up to the Commissioner how they do that, but also some of the real fundamentals in terms of what's the mechanism. It's no good saying, come and have a look at our website if people can't then access it. So as I say, we are making progress, but I don't think we are there yet. And that, again, one of the fundamental issues for me with the new Commissioner will be, what does this engagement strategy look like?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So moving to a question from Councillor Warren.
Good afternoon, Jim. My question is, how would you seek to ensure the governance arrangements of the OPCC are sufficiently robust to enable you to monitor, review and make suggestions on improving the performance of the office?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It is one of the areas that I have been thinking around in terms of the governance framework. There are multiple components to that governance framework, and it works currently. But what I am convinced about is that it's a connected system. So change one part of it has consequences through the rest. But I think when we talk governance, we place the burden on the constabulary of governance. It takes time to service a governance framework. So one of the things that I am absolutely committed to whilst I am in this role is to make sure that every bit of cost that's in that governance framework, and when I say cost, it's time, is there for a purpose, that it isn't duplication, it's not merely ticking a box. So when, as an example, I think last time I mapped it out, there were something like 14 organisations that scrutinise the constabulary in some way or other. HMIC, FRS, the Information Commissioner, the Surveillance Commissioner, HMI Prisons and Probation. You know, there's something like 15 organisations, statutory organisations, that will, in some shape or form, scrutinise the constabulary. And my personal feeling is that from a governance perspective, we probably don't use those reports sufficiently to take our assurance. So, but one of the things that is in train is mapping what that looks like against the constabulary's work. And then that will be overlaid over the internal audit programs. So every year we have an internal audit program, which is risk-based, depending on when an area of business was last risk assessed. And currently, things like the HMIC report on an area would probably not factor into whether an internal audit was going to take place, whereas I think it should. If we've just had a really good clean bill of health from HMIC FRS that have really come in and overturned every stone and had a look, I would rather internal audit than looked at another area that hasn't been looked at for a while. So in terms of that governance framework, it's very much an integrated system and understanding how one thing flows through to another. But there is, I suppose there can be a tendency in governance terms to do something because it ticks a box. I'm wanting it to be a live governance framework. So if we're having a report at BCB and a discussion, it's for a purpose, and I would expect to see that purpose reflected in something like the risk register. So if the risk register is showing there is a risk of, how are we going to be mitigating it? And that's what BCB will be about. So, you know, I'm not one for merely undertaking activity because that's what we did last year or that's what we've always done. There's got to be an absolute clear purpose linked into where's the benefit of us doing this.
Thank you, Jim. Question now from Councillor Tierney.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So I think we all know, and I think you will recognise that you're going to have limited resources going forwards because, of course, that's just the state of things. So I've got two questions with that in mind. First is, how would you intend to develop and innovate effective relationships with your stakeholders and your partners to make the best use of those limited resources? And then following that, how are you going to show that you're achieving good value for taxpayers' money?
Yeah, so in terms of I'll take the second question first. In terms of value for taxpayers' money, this is very difficult for a governance, you know, where a big part of our work is governance related, on the basis that how do you show value with that? I mean, I suppose the easy response to that would be, what do we cost compared to other offices? I routinely will do some comparisons across the country. They are difficult to do because the way that each office operates can be quite different. So the straightforward comparison, number of staff and cost compared to us, is a challenging one. But on those comparisons that I've done, we come out at the lower end of cost, but cost must come with a value. It's very difficult to put a value on the governance approach, but some crude measures are things like the amount of grants that we bring in and allocate. And so for the size of our force, because quite often grants might be dependent on the size of the force and the size of our office, we punch well above our weight in terms of bringing those grants in. But I agree with you in terms of it's an ongoing challenge, and it's part of that transparency agenda, I think, to demonstrate that. In terms of the innovation with partners, this is where the investment in our partnership working comes into it, because I have my victims lead and my offenders lead are, you know, spend a huge amount of time engaging with partners to understand their agendas. But equally, there is a level above that, really, at the sort of leaders and the public service board level, I think, where there has to be some agreement about what is our approach. So put crudely, if I was to model the challenges facing policing and community safety, it would be ever increasing demand, either in terms of numbers of incidents or complexity and time taken to deal with it. And from a local authority perspective, when we look at the safeguarding issues, that comes with increasing costs. So we know that that is the trajectory, or that has been the trajectory, and we know we've got a growing population, a significantly growing population. So there is nothing in the modelling that says demand in the future is going to go down. The question is, how do we as an entire system, local authorities, police, health, probation, you know, fire, everybody, how do we make a step change to go to early intervention and prevention? You know, it's the classic, stop fighting the alligators and drain the swamp argument. Well, it's easy to say that, but if you're surrounded by the alligators, then, you know, you need to fight them. And so there is this broader strategic discussion that needs to take place. Because if we do it as a system, it's more achievable than doing it in isolation. Because the danger is we all salami slice, and we salami slice to suit our own organisation rather than the broader benefits of the system. So I cut a function, you know, and it saves us £100, but it offloads £1,000 of cost onto you. You know, well, there's no public good in that. And so there is something about what are these outcomes we're trying to focus on. And that's one of the reasons why, despite the kind of pressure that we've been under as an office with the sort of the wake of Dr. Gregson leaving and being short of staff, staying on the COVID recovery group, you know, I've done that all the way through, because that's where the thinking around system change and how we are going to recover back to, you know, a better place than we were in before is going to come from. But I'm not saying in any way that's an easy journey.
Thank you very much, Jim. I think we've just got one final question from Councillor Shellens.
Thank you, and I am audible without spending 10 minutes trying to find my way around the system. So, Jim, you previously talked about, or you've laid emphasis on staff skills and development. I'm a huge fan of Professor Belbin and the work he did on producing effective teams, and the characteristics and relative strengths of the individuals within the team. Which facets, in your view, are relatively under strength in your existing team, and what would you intend to do about it? And if you want to talk about this offline, I'm always happy to talk about Belbin.
Yes, me too. Me too. It's funny. Part of the session I did the other day with the management team wasn't around Belbin, but it was around MBTI, where the Myers-Briggs approach, where so it's not the same, but it's a related content. It's a difficult one without doing. For me, I'm not experienced enough in the sort of the assessment approach in terms of Belbin to identify it. But what I would say is I do agree with the principle that we need a mixed team in terms of skills, because the sheer nature of the work that we do. So comms and engagement, typically the skills and personal sort of character traits of people that are strong in comms and engagement would be less strong in a compliance function and an audit function. So there is an absolute need for us to have that broad skill set in terms of natural type, if you like. But I think there is also something about overlaying that with some looking at the core values that we are wanting from this. The approach that we are here to produce an outcome for the public, that really needs to feature in everyone's thinking. It's easy in a governance function to forget that we're there for that purpose. We are not there in order to deal with complaints and set the precept per se. We're there to do that on behalf of the public. And so when going back to the neighbourhood policing example, that was why we actually went out proactively to the public to actually seek their views on it, something I don't think we'd ever done as an office before. So there is that. There's very much a values approach to my answer. Innovation for me again is critical, because I know that I don't have all the ideas. I know that my management team don't have all the ideas. I know that we've got huge IT transformation taking place. So as you know, we don't use Zoom, but we use Office 365 and Teams. There is huge functionality coming with that, but I've never used it. My management team have never used it. So, but other people, newer joiners to the office, potentially have. So, and linking back to that earlier question about how do you get members of the team to suggest things, whether they're contrary to the PCC's thinking in terms of policy or not. And that for me is the management leadership style, empowerment, engagement, because that does produce that innovation. But yes, I would be more than happy to have a lengthy discussion on Belbin and some of the other models.
Thank you very much.
I look forward to that, Jim.
Good. Thank you. I do too.
Right, well, that concludes our questions. So, I mean, Jim, are there any questions that you would like to put to us? Is there anything you would like to add to your earlier answers?
Yeah, I've got 11 questions too. No, I think I've probably spoken enough. Thank you, Chair.
Well, thank you very much. So I would now like to put it to the panel that we retire to private session under the Part 1 of Schedule 12A of the Local Government Act 1972. If any panel members object to that, could you please indicate? I'm seeing no objections. So I'd now like us to move into private session, and that means that members of the public and OPC staff, could you now please leave? But thank you very much indeed, Jim, for your time this afternoon and for giving us full and very thoughtful answers to our questions. And thank you too for your commitment and dedication over the past year or so through COVID. I know this has been particularly taxing and demanding of your time and energy. So thank you very much.